So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of ELTAI, I welcome you all for this webinar titled Translations as Literary Genre. So before we move on to the session, I request the participants to watch a promo clip of ELTAI. So here it is for you. Thank you, participants, for watching the promo clip of ELTAI. I have a few announcements to the audience. One is regarding your certificates. People who are members of ELTAI and attend the session from the beginning till the end will automatically receive your certificates in your mail. Secondly, we have a chat facility in the platform. I request the audience to post your questions and share your ideas in terms of the topic of today's webinar. You're welcome. And I request audience to not share your personal information like your email, phone number. Sometimes if you have a WhatsApp page or a web page or whatever, please don't use this chat for all those transactions. So with this, I hand over the session to today's moderator. We have Dr. N. Usha. She's a professor, Department of English, Krishna University, Machilipatnam. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, all of you. I'm very happy to be a part of the ELTAI once again. Today we are going to discuss translation studies. We all know that translation is a wonderful field of study with theory, description, and application of translation. It is important in every part of our life because not everyone speaks in English. And in India, though Hindi is our national language, most of us may not know Hindi. So we need translation from Bhasha literatures to English and also from English to our regional languages. The reality is that the cultural transfer takes place and this enables the global economy. As communication and travel advance, geography is becoming less and less of a barrier in doing business. And that's the reason why companies take advantage of translation when they move to offshore activities, remote places, and when they need to take care of the people. When there is a spread of information and ideas among these people, we need translation. And we have seen many a times that our famous epics, the Ramayana and Mahabharata, has been translated to more than 200 languages around the world. And not just that, our Panchatantra and Kathasarit has been a part of this great translation activity for ages together. So the role of translation is very important. We need effective, efficient, and empathetic translators in order to understand the various activities around us, not just in diplomacy, in linguistics. Translation is an interdisciplinary study which really requires such effective translators. Today, we have with us Professor Raj Kumar from the Department of English, Delhi University. His research areas include autobiographical studies, Dalit literature, Indian writing in English, Odia literature, and post-colonial studies. He has been a fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla in 1999 and published his major research in journals such as Social Action, Sateertha Bulletin, The Fourth World, Creative Forum, Language Forum, Jadavpur Journal of Comparative Literature, Indian Literature, Social Scientist, Journal of the School of Language, Literature and Cultural Studies, International Journal of Communication, International Journal of Religious Tourism and Pilgrimage, Ravenshaw Journal, EPW, Studies in Humanities and Social Sciences, and also Journal of Comparative Literature and Aesthetics. Professor Raj Kumar has translated literary texts from Indian languages, especially Odia, into English. His book, Dalit Personal Narratives, Reading Caste, Nation and Identity, has been published by Orient BlackSwan in 2010 and got reprinted thrice. His English translation of Akhila Naik's Bheda, the first Odia Dalit novel, was published by OUP in 2017. His book Dalit Literature and Criticism also was published by Orient BlackSwan in 2019. So, with this activity of translation, he is the speaker today on translation activities. So I request Professor Raj Kumar to take over the session, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, madam. Good evening to one and all. I want to thank Professor Mohan Raj, who was responsible for inviting me, but he's also the one who suggested this topic. I am, that not a very, that well-trained translator, but I have some commitment towards the that area of translation, and that is how I, that agreed. But I didn't know. I must thank also Professor Mohan Raj for inviting me to a, that great institution where more than 5,000 teachers are involved. I didn't know. I must tell you, I'm, that unknown to this kind of platform. And after having, that listened to this small video, I'm really happy to be part of this epic journey that, that suggested 52 years of, that great link towards the idea of reading language and literature. So thank you, Professor Mohan Raj, for giving me this chance to interact with all your, maybe, that members. I'm also equally thankful to Professor N. Usha, the moderator of today's session, and Mr. Joseph Binod, and of course, that others who are coordinating this event today. As already announced, the title of my talk today is Translation as a Literary Genre. And this is a very, that interesting area, as Professor Usha has already talked about. It is not only, that interdisciplinary, that study, but without perhaps translation, we particularly, that in global context, in general, and in particular Indian context, we may not survive. That when I talk about the idea of survival, perhaps, that civilizational gesture to know each other and to share our, maybe, that concern towards each other. Since translation as a literary genre is quite a broad and general topic, within a given time, I may not be able to do justice to the topic. So to make it particular, what I want to do today, I will try to give examples from Indian literature as an experience, that, and Dalit literature in particular, my area of interest, so that I can bring certain familiarities among today's audience. Must I emphasize here that the idea of translation is very old across countries as well as continents. As a student of English literature, we know how the texts belonging to antiquity are made available to us through translation, be it the Homeric epics, Iliad and Odyssey, that are the two texts. Every university in India and abroad are familiar. They are part of the, the text. The Bible, Greek drama, philosophy, and history, etc. Ostradur Einsteinchen and Daniel Webster, in the general introduction to their book, and I, that quote from their book, the title of the book is Translation, Theory and Practice, a Historical Reader. This was published in 2006. They emphasize the importance of translation in the following words, and I quote them. Translation has been instrumental in the formation of writing and literary culture in every European language. And when they say European here refers to more than a geographical area of Europe as defined today. Indeed, the history of international contact, what Professor Usha was mentioning a little while before, the history of international contact and cultural development within and beyond Europe can be traced by noting the roots of translation. Translation is still of the utmost importance in the affairs of a world that has gone through the rapid technological development called modernization, which furthermore had enhanced international relations to the point where people feel they can legitimately talk of globalization. While this development is far from having reached all parts of the world in equal measure, it is true that science, media, entertainment, commerce, and the many forms of international relations embrace the globe so extensively now that translation becomes an almost overwhelming issue, and in fact, a problem, because the idea of problem arises from the problem of translation, as we all know, which has a very long, colorful history. Many see a possible solution in the adaptation of a single global language, and it seems that English is well on its way to taking on this international role as Latin did in the very different circumstances of the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, unquote. Whether English is going to be a single global language in the future, we're not very sure. But for the world of literature, the need of translation is as great as ever. Must I emphasize here that someone, that was trying to make a review of Delhi University English syllabus and came to realize that nearly 60% of Delhi University English syllabus is from translated texts, 60%. I'm sure, that the other university will be having. So it is in this context, I want to say that whether, the translation is inevitable part of other subject, that I do not know, but as a student of literature, translation is definitely inevitable. It is therefore important to mention here that translation studies as a new academic discipline emerged in the late 1970s. Like we have English studies, we have women's study, now Dalit studies. So translation studies is a new discipline, autonomous and independent, which emerged in late 1970s. Since then, translation activities have flourished all over the world. As Susan Bassnett, in the preface to the third edition of her book, the title of the book is Translation Study, published in 2003, writes, and I quote her, "Once perceived as a marginal activity, translation began to be seen as a fundamental act of human exchange. Today, interest in the field has never been stronger, and the study of translation is taking place alongside an increase in its practice all over the world," unquote. About translation as a practice, there are several debates around how to translate a text, what could be the language of translation, the loss and gain in translation, the idea of untranslatability, science of translation, morality in translation, the pragmatic element of translation, and so on and so forth. It will be difficult on my part, that to elaborate all these, that elements of translation in a single lecture. It needs perhaps, that we can write several books on each of the topics that I have listed. Several writers and critics have formulated several theories on these topics. So no one can say that there is only one way to translate a text from one language to another. Take, for example, the language issue in translation, because you all are connected to the idea of language. Therefore, I thought maybe I'll just give the one example from the language. Roman Jacobson, in his article, and the title of the article is On Linguistic Aspect of Translation, distinguishes three types of translation, particularly in a language issue is concerned. And I quote, the first is, that he enlists is intra-language translation or rewording, that you have to translate from one word to another language, which is also called an interpretation of verbal sign by means of other signs in the same language. The second is interlingual translation or translation proper, whereby an interpretation of verbal sign by means of some other language. And the last and third, of course, is intersemiotic translation, or what is called transmutation, which is an interpretation of verbal sign by means of signs of non-verbal sign system, unquote. These are but a few ways to suggest how a translator has a choice to deploy many means to transfer the meanings and messages of a text the way she wants. I'm using, that if you try to understand my meanings of the, that words, the first I'm using is meanings, and then the second is, of course, messages. So if you are reading any translated text, basically, that we understand the, that meanings of the word and the messages given in the text. Critics of translation studies, however, have often warned us the ways translated text can be seriously evaluated. So there is serious evaluation about. They go on to put their records straight on the idea of a good translation and a bad translation. This is very unfortunate because, as we have already mentioned earlier, that translation can be done in any way one likes. I can give you several instances of how one text can be, or not just, that can be, or has been translated in, several times. Say, Rasa Sundari Devi's Amar Jivan. This is the first India's, that Indian woman's autobiography written in Bengali. There are two different translations. Rabindranath Tagore, Ghare Baire, Home and the World, has been translated, that twice. And Fakir Mohan Senapati, who happens to be from Odisha and called father of modern Odia literature, that his particular, that modern classic called Chaumana Atugunta, 6 acres and 7 decimal, I don't know how many of you are familiar with, had been translated into English not less than 3 times. So what does it mean? That we as a reader or an audience, we can, that very well understand about the way different translators take routes, that so far as their translation journey is concerned. So, that many writers do not buy this argument of what is a good translation and what is bad translation. Of course, that we know sometimes that the translation comes very, that not up to the standard. So far the reader is concerned, even, that people, those who have read, say, Rabindranath Tagore's, the translation of Gitanjali, there is a great critique that, that how simple translation it is. And people are always, that even though he got, that Nobel Prize for Literature, he was the first, perhaps, that Indian to get Nobel Prize way back in 1913, the standard of translation is always being, the question. Now, these are some of the examples that I can give you. But many writers do not buy this argument of what is called good translation and bad translation. Octavio Paz, a poet and writer, for example, claims that all texts being a part of a literary system are what he says, that I quote Octavio Paz, translations of translation of translations. Please, that try to understand this. He says all texts being a part of a literary system are translations in plural of translation of translations, plural. So why to put them in such a bad light? That is the question that I would like to address. I quote Octavio Paz, that when he says, every text is unique, and at the same time, it is the translation of another text. No text is entirely original because language itself, in its essence, is already a translation. As a student of language, you will very well know that when we utter certain sentences, idioms, phrases, almost we are translating it. But I think when I speak, that when I speak out, I almost translate. So this is what, that October Paz is speaking. So when he says every text is unique, and at the same time, it is the translation of another text. No text is entirely original because language itself, in its essence, is already a translation. Firstly, of the non-verbal world, and secondly, since every sign and every phrase in the translation of another sign and another phrase. However, this argument can be turned around without losing any of its validity. All texts are original because every translation is distinct. He says, all texts are original because every translation is distinct. And that's why I said that there could be also a text which can be translated into several times. Every translation up to a certain point is invention. Yes. Here, the idea of invention. Sujit Mukherjee has a book called Translation as Discovery and Translation as an Invention. There are two books by Sujit Mukherjee. So every translation, as Octavia Paz says, up to a certain point is invention, and as such, it constitutes a unique text. So every text is a unique text. This is what that Octavia Paz talks about. Now, there is another controversial area. So there could be many controversial area that translation, that studies are concerned. And, that because, that there are limited time, so I may not be able to, that give enough example from the various sectors that the translation studies really, that try to grapple with. So there is another controversial area in the field of translation. Translated text, how good it may be, always considered to be a second fiddle to the original text. I emphasize, translated text, how good it may be, always considered to be a second fiddle to the original text. For example, that how many of us, even though, that we have studied in our BA and MA, say, Iliad and Odyssey, we don't know about who are the translators because we have never read either, Iliad and Odyssey or even Ramayana and Mahabharata. You don't remember the translator. Or there are, that n number of other texts. We just take it for granted without knowing the name of the translator. We do remember the original, that author. So therefore, I say, translated text, how good it may be, always considered to be a second fiddle to the original text. So very often, we do not know the names of the translators, even though we read the text in translation. The publishers have invented many policies to this effect. You might know, that many of you are published, meaning you have published some of the books. I, being a translator, that the publisher tells me that the name of the author, original author, will be put in front, not the name of the translator. That so how good or how bad you translate, the translator goes to the oblivion. Maybe, that second page. So the reader has to struggle hard to know about whether this is an original text or translated text. So these are some of the problematics area in which, that we are dealing as translator. Lawrence Venuti, in his book, The Translator Invisibility, he uses the word invisibility. And the entire book, I must tell you, that as I was thinking, Professor Mohan Raj, it is only for the topic that I have been able to, that do some research for the first time, that bringing many of these ideas into the idea of translation. So I was going through this book by Lawrence Venuti, and the title of the book is The Translator's Invisibility, A History of Translation, where he writes, and I quote him, The translator's invisibility today raises troubling question about the geopolitical economy of culture that a greater suspicion towards translation is urgently needed to confront them. Yet, the suspicion I'm encouraging here assumes a utopian faith in the power of translation to make a difference, not only at home in the emergence of new cultural forms, but also abroad in the emergence of new cultural relations. To recognize the translator's invisibility is at once to critique the current situation and to hope for a future more hospitable to the differences that the translator must negotiate, unquote. Now, coming to Indian situation, that these are some of the passing remarks that I wanted to give you so far as, the translation in either, that Europe or America or abroad is concerned, and the theories, and of course, that the translation studies. Now, coming proper to Indian situation, how does a translator negotiate the act of translation, given the fact that India is a multilingual and multicultural society? We all know, that the problems of interacting in India, because, many parts of India, of course, that English could be the only means of communication. So if I go to South India, for example, I will not able to speak in Hindi, I will be able to perhaps, that communicate only in English, unless and until, that I, that know some local language. But in North India, for example, many parts, Hindi is the medium. So we know that. But there are problematics of, the translating one language to another, so far as India is a multilingual and that cultural, linguistic, multi-ethnic, the country is concerned. And that's why we talk about, that when we talk about India, of course, many Indias, many literatures. So, that Indian literatures are written in many tongues. That is what, the writers have already talked about. But for a translator, that it could be a problem. And here I pick up one idea from Sukanta Chaudhuri, particularly in his book called Translation and Understanding. This is the title of the book, where he comments that in a multilingual society, of course, that he brings the example from India in particular, but also generalizes so far as the multilingual society in other parts of the world are concerned. So he comments that in a multilingual society, the presence of several linguistic groups makes it difficult to not only communicate with each other, but comprehend each other's culture in a nuanced way, because language is culture. That this is the statement I just wanted to make. And if language is culture, then the nuanced way of making others, that able to understand one's culture is very important. In such a background, translation plays only a subsidiary role, he writes. And I quote Sukanta Chaudhuri here. A multilingual society obviously finds the mechanical task of translation easier, not only for languages within its ambit, but owing to the verbal faculty foster others as well. Mutatis mutandis. This is the true of linguistic interpretation across society and nations, and indeed of the entire international traffic of translation. Yet, the interpretation of nations and culture, verbally as in other modes, has been consistently imperfect, hegemonic, and even hostile. The potential intricacy of such hegemonies may be best illustrated from the Indian linguistic scene, for it incorporates a multi-level will within will, hierarchy of Indian languages set in a wider context of English and other European languages, with yet others such as Arabic and Persian. The interpretation of these elements is too complex to be traced. Actual translation plays only a subsidiary role, unquote. While Chaudhuri may be right in his approach to understand the various intricacies of translation in a multilingual society, many critics of translation may not agree with some of his observations given above. Since any text conveys the language and essence of a culture, translation aims to help readers make sense of that cultural context by inscribing the new meanings onto the recipient language. Translation becomes a complex activity because the translator has to not only know the language of the text, but also its associate grammar and metaphor. Rita Kothari, in her book Translating India, published in 2006, emphasizes this point, and I quote Rita Kothari here. It should be noted that the terms translation within quote and metaphor within quote both share similar connotation of carrying across or transferring through their etymology. Translations serve as any metaphor of understanding the other, and metaphor itself acquires a sense of translation, unquote. So Rita Kothari will agree with that theoretician like Sujit Mukherjee, who writes that translation is a discovery. For example, in my research, I always, want to tell you that when I started doing my MPhil, I wanted to study MPhil in a particular context, caste in Indian literature. I wanted to, get into the pulse of, that how Indian literature has treated caste. And I did not find any text before, prior to 1921. But 1921, that you will be happy to know that Unnava Lakshmi Narayan from Andhra Pradesh has written the first book called Malapalli way back in 1921. That is the first, that ever book written on Dalit community, at least, that a full-fledged novel. Never before, that Indian literature writes about Dalit subjectivity. And of course, that thereafter Premchand, Rangbhumi 1925, and then, that we have Chomana Dudi, Kannada, Chomas Drom in 1933, and then Mulkrajan on 1935. And now we have too many, that novel, including Anantamurti, Sanskara, Bharatipura, Arundhati Roy, God of Small Thing. And the last, that is Manu Joseph, 2012. So I now run an MPhil course called Touchable Tales, offering, that these texts as part of looking at how Indian literature has, given some space to Dalit subjectivity. That is another matter. But what I was telling you, that it is only through translation. I am sorry to say that Malapalli was, that not translated into English when I was doing my MPhil. It got translated only after I had finished my MPhil, of course, long back. So I could not, I just gave a reference to it, but now I run an MPhil course. So, that what we need to perhaps, understand that it is only through translation that we can understand the other subject, that other themes, other location, other, that race, etc., etc. So toward the end of my lecture, that let me briefly, that talk about my area of interest, Dalit literature, because now Dalit study, like translation study, is an autonomous and independent discipline. Ever since, that Dalit Panthers movement in 1972, set up the whole idea of speaking out the truth to Indian audience about Dalit suffering and exploitation. Now it is already, you know, that more than 50 years that Dalit studies have been established, not just in India. You know that you go to any part of the world, Dalit study is now an autonomous and independent discipline like translation study. Now more and more, because you know that most of the Dalit writers, they write in Indian language and hardly in English, like Meena Kandasamy, and there are one or two who write in English, but most of these writers are writing in Indian language. Translation is a big, you know, that way to not only read, but also to understand, you know, that Dalit subjectivity earlier, which was not available to many of us. And that's why it is very important that we also understand the nuances of, you know, that translation, particularly, you know, that when it comes to Dalit literature. Now, there are two or three things that I just wanted to, you know, that quickly tell you. Since most of the, you know, that the writers write always in Indian languages and hardly in English, there is a dearth of translator. Most of the translators they happen to be from, you know, that upper caste and upper class. So now the problems of, you know, that there are always problematics of translation, whether being an upper caste and class, they are able to understand the list subjectivity, that is one, because interpretation is important. And number two is, you know, that understanding certain idioms, because language is culture and Dalit language has to be understood in a particular context. But what is good thing about it that, you know, that now after maybe, you know, that the constitution has mandated compulsory education, there are more and more perhaps Dalits are getting educated. There is also Dalit middle class, as we understand, and that's where few translators, because you know that I remember few years back we had a seminar in Hyderabad University Department of English, and we talk about dearth of translator among Dalit community, and that's where, in order to fill the gap, you know, that the upper caste and upper class, you know, that are able to translate. Now, Dalit texts are selling like hot cake, hope you know, and most of the Dalit texts are, you know, that published by international repute publisher. So when it comes to translating Dalit literature, an attempt is usually made to translate a Dalit text from one regional language to English, and rarely from one Indian language group to another. I know about, you know, that certain texts like, say, Jadavpur's Baluta, which is the very early Dalit autobiography, is translated into Hindi as Achyut. Say Balbir Madhavpuri is a Punjabi Dalit writer whose autobiographical Changyaru has been translated into Hindi. And now we are told that it is now translated into Urdu and got published in Pakistan also. And Bama's Karuku, for example, has been translated in as many as 16, you know, that both Indian and foreign languages. So we know about, you know, that. But then there should be also a consistent efforts by, you know, that Indian translators to translate Dalit texts in Indian languages. That is what, you know, that I'm telling. So why do, you know, that most of the Dalit texts are getting English, you know, that translated into English and rarely in Indian languages? This is because English is considered to be a linked language in many parts of India, which I have already, you know, that emphasized earlier. Translating Dalit text into English enables Dalit literature reach a global audience, and mobilize resistance against human rights violation. So what is good thing about, you know, that, say, Dalit studies getting disseminated world over is that immediately, you know, that people are able to not only understand about Dalit suffering, but they are also, you know, that mobilizing resistance wherever there is any violation of human rights. So I think, you know, that I should, meaning I also wanted to tell you that there is politics of translation, as we all know. One is, you know, that who translate, number one. Number two, what could be the, that choosing of a particular text. And the third, of course, that the language that is being used. For example, that I'll just give you quickly before I conclude. I'm almost, done through my paper. There are definitely some, dangerous, that signal so far as the translation of Dalit texts are concerned. Say, Saran Kumar Limbale's autobiography, which is, that very powerful. I have never read any, such a powerful autobiography. I must have, that I did my PhD in autobiography. I must have read hundreds of autobiography, but I have never come across such, that powerful autobiography, because at the age of 25, he wrote as an angry young man, giving the title Akarmasi. Now, if you understand the title, Akarmasi could be a bastard child, because there is a tradition in India that a Dalit woman, young Dalit woman, is to be enjoyed by upper caste landlords. As long as she is young, that the landlords enjoys, and there are children. And the children, that burn out of those women who are considered to be kept women, that mothers are known, but fathers are not known, because fathers, they don't want to be associated with the children. And that's why the title Akarmasi. Akarmasi in English will be bastard. When the translator chooses to give a title, and also publisher, and maybe, that editor also, this is published by Oxford University Press, called the outcast. Now, Basan Mohan, the person who edited all the works of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, writings and speeches, he has written an autobiographical Basti. Gail Ombed translated it. She was our dear friend, of course. Basti could be, that it is particularly, that it could be a locality, that Basti, because he talks about the geographical, that surrounding in which, that he came all the way from his village to Mumbai. Now, the title of the English, the title of his autobiography is Growing Up Untouchable in India. Look at, that. So, Basti becomes Growing Up Untouchable in India. Balbir Madhopuri Changya Rukh in Punjabi, of course, that, which means, that you remember about bonsai tree. So if you translate it, it would be potted plant. But the translator and also editor and publishers, they have given the title Against the Night. Against the Night. These are some of the examples, that how the essence of the text could be lost. Let me, that conclude, because we are almost towards the end of the time given. So finally, we can conclude our talk saying that translation as a literary genre has evolved over the years. With the coming of translation studies, translation has got new direction, exploring new grounds and bridging gaps in several areas, such as stylistics, literary history, linguistic, semiotics, and aesthetic, to name few. Hope in the post-globalized world, translation will flourish further and make the human world a better place to live in. Thank you, one and all, for your patient listening. Thank you. I'm done, Professor Usha.
Thank you very much, sir. It was a pleasure listening to you on translation studies. Dear friends, Professor Raj Kumar has given us a brief introduction to translation studies, the different concepts in translation. He has also touched upon some Indian texts in translation, which have been translated from the Bhasha literatures, the regional languages, into English. And he has also given us some issues in translation. Professor Raj Kumar also spoke about some of the Dalit texts, the important Dalit texts which have been translated in the contemporary times, and the issue in the titles. For example, the native titles given to these texts suffer when they are translated into English. Maybe that is the reason why many of our translated texts have retained the same title even after translation. You all, I'm sure, would know about Chemin, the famous Malayali novel. It has remained as Chemin even in English. Then Sangati or Kariku by Bama, also the same title goes in English. So in that way, we have many number of texts which have been retained in the same way in English. Um, Professor Raj Kumar also dealt with some of the important theorists like Susan Bassnett, Raymond Jacobson, um, Sujit Mukherjee in Indian context, and he has spoken about some of the important ideas related to translation studies. Now the session is open for you all for the question answer session. I'm sure there are many enthusiasts who would like to clarify, who would like to get some of these ideas clarified. Uh, Professor Raj Kumar, I would like to ask you the first question. That is, I am also a translator from Telugu to English language. I've translated the first Telugu play, Gurja Dapparau's Kanyasulkam, into English as part of a publication project, and also some of the short stories from Telugu women writers into English for Sahitya Academy. My question is, when you have translated the Odia book into English, what are the problems you have faced in translating your book, the first English translation, the first Dalit novel, that is Akhila Naik's Bheda? So can you please tell us about that?
Yeah, thank you, madam. Yeah, so thank you, that for giving brief overview of my talk. That I'm happy that it perhaps went well to the audience, because I could see some of the writings, that it was quite insightful, etc., etc. So, they're thankful to all of your audience. Now, madam, that Akhila Naik Bheda is the first Odia Dalit novel, and it happens to be from my area. That I belong to Kalahandi region of Odisha, which is considered to be backward and very, that it is considered to be not only backward, but also, that the region which is, that full of poverty, malnutrition, poverty, that called Somalia of India. So Akhila Naik and me, we come from the same region. The writer also is from Kalahandi. Now, the problems that I face, of course, is definitely some of the words, that the idioms and, that some of the words that he used, which are people's, that everyday language, which are hardly available in English. That was the first, that so even though I'm that a professor of English, I could not able to translate many of the idioms. So that's there is a word called legre lega. It rhymes very well, but then very difficult to get translated. There could be several words like this. So what I have done, madam, is that I written some of the original words of that local language into English, and then that I thought I, of course, that consulted with my editor and the publisher, and that's where the glossary suggested that some of these possible translated words into English. So that is the first thing that I thought as a problem. Local language that too, that if you know about Odia language, this is a book not written in textbook Odia language, because in Odisha also we have several, that say Odia is basically the language of the coastal Odisha, and we happen to be, that far away from coastal Odisha. Say my place is 550 kilometers away from Bhubaneswar, say. And it becomes difficult for us to, that track down the textbook Odia language. So I must tell you that when we were studying in primary school, some of the textbook that refer to certain words we could not understand. So even though, that I claim to be an Odia, I would not be able to comprehend some of the Odia, idioms. So Akhil likes, deploying of certain local idioms was the first problem. That is. The second, of course, that the structural and stylistic, which I could, overcome. And the third, of course, that the and as a the student of literature, we are also mindful about our grammar. So the sentence structure, and particularly, that what Akhil Naik was trying to do, he clubbed both present tense and past tense. That sometime intermittently. So I had to perhaps that do away with it, making it only that simple pass. So these are some of the things I that must try to share it with you. Thank you, madam.
Thank you very much, sir. Now I would like to give some of the questions asked by the audience. Please answer these, sir. Ms. Nagaveni NV, she has asked the question, which translation is inevitable? Translation of literature from Indian languages or from other languages into Indian languages?
This idea of inevitability, that I said that I think, that when we translate from one Indian language to another, then we, that we are concerned about, that whom we are translating for. Say, if I'm translating from a Telugu, say a Telugu text into Odia, I know about my Odia readership. But when I translate an Odia text into English, then it reaches to the global audience. So that's why, that I suggested that there is also politics of choosing a text and translating. But that doesn't mean that, that we cannot think about, say, translating an Indian language text into another Indian languages. So I think, that when we talk about inevitability of, the translating a text, it could be, that both. Why not, that translate into, that English as well as an Indian language, so that at least, that people will come to know about. So this will be my answer.
Yes, sir. I'm sure you have seen the WhatsApp. There are a number of questions, and also there are many good wishes to you, sir. Our friends seem to have liked your session, and they have thanked you for giving a wonderful session on translation studies. The next question by Ms. Jayshree Singh is that why has English literature discipline in its curricula negated the use of translingual, bilingual pedagogy in teaching, although lots of rendering of literary pieces is done in English language?
I think, that we have overcome, that particularly when I gave the example of Delhi University using 60% of the text, nearly 60% as translated text. What we have done is we are not just simply, that we are using even Indian text translated into English, apart from, the Premchand. We have now, that I must try to clarify here that we have a full-fledged paper called Caste and Literature. That many of the texts are translated from Indian language into English. There are also, say, Greek, Latin, we all know, that French, German, and many of the other languages. So I think, that English department, perhaps, that now all over the world I'm talking about, that and particularly in Indian context, I can vouch that
Sir, you're audible, sir. Go on, sir. Now you're audible. Yeah, you have the question on the chat box, sir. Yeah, Usha
Yes,
ma'am
sir.
is there. Yeah.
Sir, I lost connection in between. Going back. Uh, yes, sir. I'll read it. I'll read it, sir. Um Mr. Swapnil Salunke says that please give insights about maintaining balance to remain true to the original work in translation. you, sir. One more question. Mr. Sandeep Patil congratulated you. Okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
ma'am. Usha, ma'am, you move on to the vote of thanks. Yeah, I think we should stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Raj Kumar, for enlightening us about translation studies in India, about Dalit literature in translation into English, and also about your, remarks on the issues of translation in contemporary times. It was a good session, and there was a lot of feedback on your session. Many students, research scholars, faculty members congratulated you on this particular topic and also raised a few questions and asked you for different suggestions on how to translate from literature from their own native language into English and vice versa. Today, it was an enriching session on translation studies. There was also one issue saying that Usha ma'am, in Hindi is not our national language. I do understand, Mr. Arvindan, that Hindi is not our national language, of course, but we all, need to understand that we need a lingua franca. We have communicated in English even today in this session, and I hope, we'll not raise unnecessary issues in this seminar and constructively talk about academic issues. There are many other questions also, but as we need to end this session today, it's really a wonderful opportunity given to me to moderate this. And thank you very much, Professor Raj Kumar. Thank you, Professor Mohan Raj. Thank you, ELTAI, for giving me this opportunity. We will definitely join again for a more fruitful session next week. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Praveen, for conducting this session so well. And also I thank Mr. Joseph for coordinating everyone here.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you all.
Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome. So, dear participants, I know we have taken 10 minutes of your time, but very quickly I'll talk about the next week's webinar. So, it falls on 6th of February. The title of the next week's seminar is English as E-Language. The resource person will be Dr. Ganga Mahot, Assistant Professor, Regional Institute of English, NCERT, Bhopal. So I request the participants to register for this webinar also and get enlightened. Thank you.